What will happen to China if Donald Trump wins the election? Think about it. Donald Trump came to Washington with a completely anti-China speech. He imposed tariffs that went down in history as one of the biggest tax hikes for Americans in peacetime. And since then, China has gone from being the #1 trading partner, the most popular guy at the party, to being a military and economic enemy, and practically the devil himself. So, will things get even worse if Donald Trump returns to the White House? Well, the truth is that whether Donald Trump wins or not, the alternative doesn't look much better either. Joe Biden has not let up. Quite the contrary. During his term, he has not only maintained tariffs, but he has added fuel to the fire. Are you familiar with laws such as the Inflation Reduction Act or the CHIPS Act? These are all laws that Biden has passed to destroy the Chinese technology sector in favor of the US sector. And you may ask, wouldn't it be better for the two powers to work together instead of waging absurd economic wars? Yes, and in fact, that was the norm over recent decades. Western factories had cheap labor in China, and the Asian giant received jobs and a major development of its industrial fabric. The problem is that over time, the factories that produced plastic trinkets learned to manufacture much more value-added products. That is, they stopped being the assemblers and became the designers. Here we're talking about everything from electric cars to batteries, solar panels, and even drones. The point is that these technologies are new enough that Western countries do not have a huge head start, but at the same time, simple enough that China can mass produce them. But do you want an example? Think about cars. Historically, Europe and the US were ahead in their production. China could not even overshadow combustion engines like those of Volkswagen or Ford. However, now the electric car has arrived and changed everything. Europe does not have the advantage of tradition because it is a fairly new product, and China has taken the lead. The outcome? The Chinese have started to compete on a level playing field with Westerners. But even worse, they have also started stealing many patents and intellectual property from the West. For example, this is not a Volkswagen Beetle. It is the Chinese and electric copy from the brand Aura. Or look at this car. This is not a Land Rover, it's a Land Wind. Come on, they didn't even try very hard to change the name. As you can imagine, intellectual property theft is not just limited to cars, it is a common norm in the country's industry. And the most significant issue is that the Chinese military could be greatly advantaged by copying intellectual development from the West. So with all these contributing factors, the trade war is a little better understood. We don't defend it, but we can't deny that there are underlying motives behind it. But what exactly does this war consist of? By what mechanisms is the US attacking Chinese companies? How is the Asian giant responding to the attacks? And perhaps the most important question, who's winning? Today on Visualeconomik, we tell you all about it, so stay tuned. But before that, imagine a world where investing aligns seamlessly with your personal preferences, risk tolerance, and asset preferences, all without consuming your time. This place exists and is accessible with just a click at InvestMe, an automated investment platform. InvestMe, a highly customizable robo-advisor, employs algorithms and expert guidance to manage your investments automatically. Simply set your investment goals, activate the autopilot, and InvestMe optimizes your financial journey to your treasure island. Unsure if it's right for you? Visit their website and experiment with the Simulate Your Investment tool. This feature helps you understand your investor profile, align investments with your needs, and devise strategies that fit your objectives. Whether it's crafting a retirement plan, protecting savings from inflation, or venturing into high-risk, high-reward assets, InvestMe offers endless possibilities. You can start by scanning the QR code displayed or clicking the link provided to run your first investment simulation on InvestMe and discover your investor type, be it adventurous, conservative, or a blend of both. Feel free to share your results in the comments for discussion. Thank you to InvestMe for their support, and let's proceed with today's video. Incidentally, the US-China trade war has plunged Hong Kong into a deep crisis. The city's economy has contracted in 3 of the last 5 years, while its stock market, which remains one of the world's largest, has fallen by nearly 50% since 2018. However, things could be starting to change. The pessimism around this city may have gone too far, and that could be fueling a great opportunity for investors from around the world. At the risk of oversimplifying, we could say that the American strategy has 2 main pillars: attacking Chinese production and boosting domestic production. But let's start with the first. How on earth does the US plan to attack Chinese factories? Well, the first move is to leave their factories without microchips.
Biden administration clamps down on China's access to chip technology.
You could say that advanced chips are the oil of the 21st century. Without them, developing state-of-the-art weaponry such as the F-35 aircraft or training advanced artificial intelligence becomes a real odyssey. To give you an idea, training an artificial intelligence chatbot, like the famous ChatGPT, requires about 30,000 A100 chips. And of course, Joe Biden knows it. So much so that the Americans have banned the export of chips to all industries with technologies related to military use. But in non-military cases, the government is forcing companies to keep track of how the Chinese use their products. Here, control is maximum. But what about other products that do not have military uses? So here we come to the second part of the problem. Uncle Sam does not want China to continue to have access to advanced technologies from which they can learn, steal intellectual property, or integrate into more complex production chains. The main concern is no longer that China will buy advanced microchips, but that by stealing technology, it will learn to produce them itself, thereby increasing its military potential while eating into the US economy at the same time. Be that as it may, we could say that these sanctions are still relatively light and affect a very small percentage of all the investment that Americans make in the Asian giant. But in Beijing, they know perfectly well that this is only the first step in a trade war that will most likely continue to escalate. And so the question is, how have the Chinese reacted to this new Biden blockade? The answer is in several ways. The first has been to boost domestic microchip production in order to become less dependent on exports. As you can see on the screen, the Asian giant has started to buy machinery to produce chips on its own. We're talking about nothing less than a 50% growth since these sanctions were approved. But do you want a more concrete case? This is a lithography machine used to sculpt microchips, and China has increased its imports by 270%. Although it may not seem like it, all this has had rather comical consequences. For example, after the US announced the sanctions, Japan reduced its exports of microchips to China by $2.5 billion. But in the same period of time, Japanese exports of machines to manufacture those same microchips grew by more than $5 billion. Right now, China is like someone who stops buying ready-made meals to buy frying pans and play the cook on social media. However, this is far from the end of the story. Stay tuned for more news.
China's military and government acquire NVIDIA chips despite US ban.
That's right. Despite the ban, late model chips continue to arrive in China, and worst of all, no one knows quite how. I'm sure many of you will think that a large black market controlled by underworld groups and criminal organizations has emerged, right? The answer is no. Most likely, the microchips are being smuggled in through specific individuals. For example, through a university professor who orders 100 chips for his project when he only needs 95, and the 5 left over he sells to China. Although what I can say is that it doesn't look as if the black market is going to be Xi Jinping's main policy with regard to semiconductors. After all, you can't depend on a tiny black market forever. So what is the solution? Well, it will probably continue with its commitment to improve domestic production, but not everything is going to be a bed of roses. On the one hand, the machines they have purchased for chip production do not include the latest models, which are the ones that make it possible to manufacture the most advanced microchips. Perhaps in the future, China will be able to manufacture these machines itself, but for now, it will have to make do with somewhat slower chips. But then again, it doesn't look like China will be able to keep importing machines for much longer. If you have taken a good look at the last graph we showed you, the boom in machine imports has come mainly from 2 countries, Japan and the Netherlands. Thus, the Dutch company ASML, which, by the way, is the manufacturer of the machine that we showed you earlier, went from selling 14% of its production to China to 29% in just 1 year. But one thing was clear, the US has not been silent.
United States, the Netherlands, and Japan reportedly reached a deal establishing advanced semiconductor equipment export controls.
Now, not only the US, but also its allies are turning off the tap. ASML itself has already announced that it expects to reduce its sales to China by 15%. And what can I say? It does not seem that this type of alliance against the Chinese is going to weaken. Even less so when Xi Jinping has added fuel to the fire with his counter-espionage law. And what does this law consist of, you may ask? In short, it's a law that allows the Chinese Communist Party to control the activity of American companies in its territory. As you can imagine, this has not brought any joy to Washington, so everything indicates that the new tension will only increase from now on. Nevertheless, as we've already mentioned, this is only one of the 2 pillars of the US strategy. Believe me when I tell you that the US is not content with just wanting to reduce China's production. It also wants to become a manufacturing powerhouse itself. Biden is devoting all his efforts to stealing factories from China. Yes, that's right. The American government wants factories to leave China and move to America. The question is, how does it intend to achieve this? By spending tons and tons of cash. To give you an idea, since 2007, the investment in factories and other infrastructure needed for the manufacturing industry was in the range of $6 billion. Well, Biden has tripled the figure, and it now exceeds $18 billion. Or if you want to put it another way, at least in terms of bringing production back to the United States, Joe Biden has made Donald Trump's famous Make America Great Again slogan a reality. But don't think that's all there is to it. Check out the next news item.
Biden to quadruple tariffs on Chinese EVs.
So far, we have seen Biden subsidize the domestic industry, but it hasn't stopped there. It turns out that the government also wants to undermine the competitiveness of Chinese manufacturers. And how does it do that? With what we have just seen, with tariffs. In that sense, electric vehicles have become, along with microchips, the main battlefront in the trade war. And you may be wondering, are the tariffs beneficial to the United States? Well, the truth is that it depends on how you look at it. At the economic level, tariffs are a tax that make foreign products more expensive, and that undoubtedly decreases the purchasing power of Americans. But at the political and military level, the issue is much broader. Be that as it may, what is clear is that tariffs are a quick and easy policy to implement, and furthermore, they force China to subsidize its industries to make them competitive, which in turn drains the government of resources that could go to other matters such as weapons. So what's the conclusion? All this explains why, since Biden launched his plans from 2021, the amount of goods the US imports from China has plummeted. And yes, I know what many of you are thinking. Well, check out the ultra-capitalist country that kills free trade when it thinks it stands to lose. But Washington sees it differently. What's more, most congressmen probably think that all these policies are aimed at defending free trade from China's manipulation. And what manipulation are we talking about? The answer lies in the most fashionable word right now in the international business press: overcapacity. By overcapacity, we mean what we have already told you. China heavily subsidizes its manufacturing, producing far more than the world demands. And if you're wondering why it's only now that the alarm bells are ringing, well, this chart makes it clear. On this channel, we have talked many times about the real estate bubble that the country is experiencing. But what you may not know is that the method chosen by the Chinese Communist Party to deflate the bubble has been to move all the credit from the real estate sector to the industrial sector. And of course, if one country overproduces, another has to overconsume. In other words, the Chinese are selling at super cheap prices, and we, instead of consuming from our own industry, are overconsuming Chinese products. So what's the problem? Let them continue to subsidize us. All the better for us. Well, no. The problem is that we are sacrificing industrial power in exchange for buying cheap. And keep in mind, it is one thing to buy cheap because foreigners are more competitive, and quite another to buy cheap because the Chinese government is driving us to do so. The real problem will be if we abandon our industry. China takes the lead, and once they have control, they abandon subsidies. Then we will have no choice but to buy expensive goods from China. And it is precisely for this reason that politicians in the US and Europe are increasingly against letting Chinese subsidized goods through.
People like me grew up with the view: if people send you cheap goods, you should send a thank you note. That's what standard economics basically says. I would never ever again say, send a thank you note.
Now, none of this is to say that Americans don't subsidize their companies as well. Of course they do, but at a fundamentally different level. On top of that, what if I told you that Biden's subsidy policy could be a huge failure? So far, we only have data on how much money is going into the manufacturing sector, but many of the projects could be a bottomless pit. Do you want an example? Well, to mention just one of many similar cases, a $7.5 billion plan to build electric car chargers has only resulted in 7 stations being erected across the country over 2 years. And the problem is not only that. With the excuse of cutting ties with China, the US is not making much effort to improve its trade relations with allied countries. For instance, Joe Biden vetoed Japan's purchase of US steel, with the cry, "American steel will be worked by Americans." Pure nationalism, the good old-fashioned way. But in view of all this, perhaps the most important question of all remains: how is China responding to the American trade attacks? Hold on to your chair, because Xi Jinping is learning new tricks from an old acquaintance, none other than Vladimir Putin.
China circumvents US tariffs by shipping more goods via Mexico.
We're going to make an entire video on this topic in detail in the coming days, so subscribe to not miss it. But in a nutshell, just as Russia evades sanctions on its oil by putting "Made in Kazakhstan" on the label, China does the same with Mexico. Since Biden approved his package of measures, China's exports to Mexico have grown by 50%. And we are not only talking about Mexico, but in other countries such as Vietnam, the exact same thing is happening. To give you an idea, the US has reduced its imports from the Asian country by 8% in the last 2 years. However, some economists estimate that 5 of those 8 points are basically lies. Goods that the US buys from China, but via third countries. However, there is a small nuance to all this data. Let's be clear, what China is doing with Mexico and Vietnam is not the same as what Russia is doing with Kazakhstan or India to evade sanctions. Mexicans don't just erase the "Made in China" from the products they receive, put a "Made in Mexico" sticker on, and sell it to the gringos. No, they do not. What happens is that these countries are importing semi-finished goods. For example, a cell phone in pieces. They assemble it, and then they can pass it off as a Mexican product. China is simply accelerating a long-standing trend. Just as US companies delegated part of their production to China a few decades ago, now China is doing the same. And some economists believe that this may be the first step for these countries to develop an industry of their own and end up cutting ties with China, as China is currently doing with the US. In other words, the cat that chases its own tail. Of course, Mexico still has serious problems of violence and lack of political will, and Vietnam does not seem ready to receive huge amounts of foreign investment. So in any case, the Mexico-China war will be a long time coming. Be that as it may, the truth is that the trade war between China and the US has only just begun, but the first consequences are already visible. The US has returned to industrial policy with a vengeance. The world seems to increasingly reject absolute free trade, and sanctions and tariffs are reaching levels that were unthinkable just a decade ago. Because of all this, in 2023, China recorded negative foreign direct investment for the first time since it opened up to the world at the end of the 20th century, and no one knows what will happen in the future. But at this point, it's up to you. How far do you think the conflict will continue to escalate? Do you think that Western countries should accept subsidized goods from China with a smile? You can leave me your answer in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel, hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it, and I'll see you in the next one. All the best. See you next time.